When faced by the 41st millennium's greatest horrors, from the depths of the warp to the fringes of known space, the Imperium of Man often turns to its most powerful weapons. Together, they embody its tried and true maxim: if it doesn't work, build bigger. And therein we find the Volcano Cannon, so named for its ability to turn solid rock into rivers of flowing lava. The Volcano Cannon is among the most powerful laser weapons fielded by the Imperium, superseded only by the Lance-type laser batteries employed by planetary defences and the ships of the Imperial Navy, the Navis Imperialis. Its sheer size, recoil and power consumption demand its fitting to only the largest and most robust Imperial vehicles, such as the Shadow Sword and various class of Titan. Like most laser-based weapons, its primary purpose is armor-piercing, literally melting its way through countless layers of plasteel and ceramite, and when it is deployed against heavy vehicles or even groups of smaller vehicles, they may very often be simply vaporized instantly. Even Titans, protected by void shields and clad in adamantium, the strongest material known to man, are vulnerable to the devastating power of the Volcano Cannon. A single blast against a Titan may cause it to lose entire limbs and major functionality to a well-aimed blast. For the smaller Warhound class Titans may see them destroyed completely. A direct hit will leave nothing but a smoking pair of legs, or worse, a catastrophic meltdown of its reactor, creating a massive detonation, levelling friendly units within even a fairly peripheral proximity. Like many of the Imperium's most impressive weapons, the exact origins of the Volcano Cannon are unclear and may most likely originate in some form out of the Dark Age of technology. The key to its modern construction can be found in a single mineral vein on the mining world of Syndoros 11, where a unique crystal lends its focusing properties to the cannon's devastating blast. Following a failed plot by heretic psykers to unseat the planet's governor, the dead heretics' collective psychic energy somehow appeared to have imbued itself in the rocks surrounding their bodies, and over countless years geological forces have compressed and concentrated these energies. But the crystal's rarity and devastating results make Syndoros 11 of immense strategic value to the Imperium, followed by the small handful of Forge worlds which produce the cannon itself: Esteban 3, Griffin 4, Phaeton, and of course Mars. The Volcano Cannon has undergone a series of developments since the years of the Great Crusade. Its first variant, Mark I, apparently proved way too volatile for practical use, much like the successor Mark II, which despite its improved reliability completely destroyed the arms of Titans and the hulls of tanks that carried it. The Mark IV Phaeton pattern is most commonly seen across the Imperium's battlefields today, which despite being a step down in power from the Mark II, remains utterly devastating. Even the 4 massive purpose-built capacitors on the Imperial Guard's Shadow Swords are completely drained by a single shot of the weapon, and its blast is sometimes described as a linear sun by the way it can turn night into day, blinding friend and foe alike. The hardened systems of Leman Russ and Baneblade tanks alike are overwhelmed by the massive release of energy, overloading and requiring time to reboot. Rocks and metal are instantly vaporized, and even the air itself will be ignited, potentially incinerating any nearby infantry and reportedly driving some survivors insane. In a perhaps relevant tangent, the weapon's hypersonic crackling has been speculated to contain the final screams of Syndoros 11's dead heretic psykers, not entirely dissimilarly to the rumours surrounding the Quake cannon. But this is of course great concern to those who monitor any such effects upon Imperial operators. And while continual assessment of Shadow Sword and Titan crews have resulted in no reports of adverse behaviour, the Imperium still considers it necessary to order periodic purges of escorting infantry, and by purge you can assume this means execution of likely loyal and well-serving Imperial troops. Still, within the scale of the Imperium, this is deemed more than an acceptable price to pay for the Volcano Cannon's presence on the battlefield. Of course, such great power does come at a cost. Like the weapon itself, the huge vehicles to which it must be mounted tend to be unwieldy and rare. The Shadow Sword's capacitors can barely support the Volcano Cannon's power consumption, being completely depleted by even a single firing and rendering the tank temporarily immobile and vulnerable. Recharging for a second shot can take even up to 2 minutes, and the weapon's huge size also requires it to be mounted directly to the hull, meaning the entire vehicle must turn in order to acquire targets or keep track of moving ones. More manoeuvrable opponents may be impossible to engage at all, and this paired with the tank's limited mobility means it must be escorted at all times. As such, the Shadow Sword's Volcano Cannon is best designated as a scaled-up tank destroyer, a weapon purpose-built to eliminate enemy armoured targets and titans in particular. For all the Volcano Cannon's expense and rarity, the Shadow Sword is one of only a few weapons the Imperial Guard can use to counter the titans, that is, short of masses of weaker but concentrated firepower. But titans represent some of the most expensive projects undertaken by the Imperium and can take centuries to construct. They represent a massive commitment to any given battlefield, and so a critical strike by a well-placed volcano cannon can turn the tide of a battle against the heretics or loyalists, or even against an entire planetary campaign. Unfortunately for the Guard, by the 41st millennium, the Shadow Sword has grown increasingly rare due to the complexity of building and operating the main gun. To make matters worse, each volcano cannon can survive only 1500 shots before becoming dangerously volatile. Consequently, while the Volcano Cannon excels at destroying heavy fortifications or super heavy tanks, most Guard commanders are wary of deploying the weapon outside of its main Titan killer role. Even rarer and more prized was the Shadow Sword's cousin, the Falchion, which roamed the battlefields of the early Imperium. In a ludicrous display of firepower, the Falchion featured a pair of twin-linked volcano cannons, though exactly how the tank's capacitors supported the weapon's function is unclear. Even the massive plasma reactor of the Warlord-class Titan can barely support multiple volcano cannons, but perhaps the necessary technology has simply been lost to time since the early days of the Crusade. The Falchion variant was assigned specifically for Astartes use and was designated during this period as a super heavy tank destroyer. It combines technologies used from both the Fellblade and Shadow Swords, and the completely insane power of two volcano cannons meant that this vehicle was an extremely high investment resource for a single unit, and so very few were produced. In the modern period of M41, it's unknown how many Falchion destroyers have survived, but their extreme rarity will place them as some of the most highly prized weapons and only be used as relic weaponry. Their deployment to battle is almost unheard of in the modern Imperium, but it can happen. And should a chapter deem it necessary, such a vehicle will be heavily supported by additional units, and its sheer firepower is more than capable of turning a battle for the Space Marines even while they face far superior numbers. Its rarity also additionally can give the Astartes in M41 an element of both surprise and stunned shock by their enemies. The power of a twin volcano cannon is not something seen perhaps ever by some enemies the Imperium face, such as the Tau, and the insane power of a super heavy Falchion destroyer would inevitably leave any of the most powerful Xenos war machines vaporized or cut to pieces before battle had barely even begun. But the use of the Falchion destroyer was well demonstrated during the Great Crusade itself, when newfound enemies of humanity, now long since dead and forgotten, were exposed for the first time to the sheer power of the Imperium. The Falchion itself was developed long before the period of the Heresy, and in this time it was not designated to counter or engage the Titans, which would become almost exclusively its battlefield role later. As the Great Crusade encountered ever more well-equipped and resistant Xenos, or even some human enclaves, some of the war machines that were used to resist the new Imperium were of a scale which required significantly more apocalyptic firepower. One such species were the bizarre beings of the so-called Scion Reach, who were so massive they could crush entire deployments with their bulk alone. But when an Astartes force of Ultramarines engaged them with Falchion super heavy destroyers, they were set ablaze in a horrifying display of ostentatious Imperial might. The Xenos were not only the ones though to see the true power of the Imperium in this time, and the Iron Hands Legion were forced to deploy Falchions against the fortresses of the Thulos Deeps, who had rejected Imperial compliance. After the Iron Hands had finished their engagement, all that remained was charred rubble or liquefied rock. If nothing else, the Falchion super heavy destroyer was a potent display of Imperial power, and a single deployment could be more than sufficient to turn a resistant human planet into a state of begrudging compliance as a member of the new and all-encompassing empire of the Emperor's Imperium. It is well known, of course, that tanks are not the only mount available for a volcano cannon. Its vast energy consumption is best supported by the plasma reactors of battle titans, and these allow one or more to be fitted to a single machine, though the volcano cannon is still too demanding for the smaller Warhound class titans. But it is on these titans that the weapon's power truly shines, enabling a potent combination of range, firepower and mobility that can stop entire armoured battalions in their tracks. As such, while Titans are themselves rare, the Volcano Cannon is among the most common of weapons mounted on their hardpoints or carapace, and there are several variations in keeping with the Titan's size, from those designated for the Reaver class Titan to the Bellicossa Volcano Cannon, a variety of truly spectacular destructive power, as well as fielding double the range. The Bellicossa is a rarity within a rarity, most seen during the days of the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, and like seemingly so many things of decreasing number since. The Bellicossa is a large enough and demanding weapon that it may only be fitted to the massive Warlord class Battle Titan, or of course the god among god engines, the Imperator. The Imperator's immense hulk can support as many as 6 volcano cannons, a truly obscene level of firepower. If a single volcano cannon is enough to cripple a smaller Titan or blow open a hardened fortress, 6 could eliminate an entire conventional army, a whole banner of Imperial Knights, or a maniple of smaller Titans. Where most of a Titan's weapons are devastating in their own way, from the Sun Fury Plasma Annihilator to the equally large Quake Cannon, the thing that truly sets the Volcano Cannon apart is its combination of range, precision and relative reliability. While the Sun Fury can fire in overwhelming bursts, it is at best a medium range weapon, and the Quake Cannon's blast is incomparable. But a Titan's Volcano Cannon can be focused against key defensive hardpoints or individual moving vehicles and carve away another Titan's limbs like a heretic being prepared for conversion to a life of servitor servitude. Without the Shadow Sword's 2-minute cooldown and immobility, a Titan's Volcano Cannon can also keep up a steady, if slow, enfilade of fire, making it a much more reliable and adaptable weapon on a changing battlefield. And unlike the Quake Cannon's shells or the Plasma Annihilator's energy, its concentrated beam also requires no travel time and can be used to target enemies even at a close range, because its potential for friendly fire and other unintended consequences is relatively limited. Especially compared to the Quake Cannon, a weapon known to open fissures which could swallow entire regiments alive, plus as an energy weapon it will never run out of shells, though anything less than an Imperator Titan will need to be careful not to overtax its reactor should its crew choose to mount 2 volcano cannons together. Another iteration, or one might say a close relation to the Titan's Volcano Cannon, is the Knight Castellan's Volcano Lance. This is a slightly smaller weapon, but with almost as much destructive power. Although a Titan or a Shadow Sword's Volcano Cannon may pack a more powerful punch, to say nothing of the Bellicossa, the Castellan's relative speed and maneuverability means that the weapon can be employed with far more finesse. Fixed defences can be bypassed a tank, or Titan's weaker flanks can be targeted, and its smaller size might allow it to avoid the instant concentration of firepower a massive Titan might receive. A Volcano Lance might even remain useful in situations where Volcano Cannon would be a liability, such as urban or forested combat. And while the cannon is still king in terms of firepower, the Lance is a far more adaptable weapon with its own combat niche. But then to scale things up on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the Defense Laser, which is a fixed weapon designated for planetary defense. Without going too much into detail on this topic, because the defense laser beams are far more in common with the Lance-type weapons on Imperial starships, but older reference concerning volcano cannons, specifically the original Adeptus Titanicus, referred to them as defense lasers. Now, we might just read into this as a case of ever-changing lore or even a mistake, but it's certainly interesting to speculate whether the volcano cannon might have once been employed in a purely defensive capacity. Its drawbacks, namely power consumption and recoil, would be completely solved by a large fortification's ferrocrete foundations and built-in huge reactors. It's certainly reasonable to assume that a base's power plant, without the weight limitations imposed by a Titan's mobility requirements, could support multiple such demanding weapons. An argument, though, against this is the idea that there are very few targets large enough to warrant such a weapon to be used to engage with, and so it would be a waste for such a rare weapon to remain in a fixed position and unable to be deployed where it is most needed. That's the benefit of the more mobile units, either tanks or Titans. However, this also doesn't take into consideration that the volcano cannon's likely period of creation was during either the Dark Age of Technology or the Age of Strife, although in this period it may well have been known by another name and perhaps even a slightly different variant. During this era, such weapons were almost certainly easier to produce, and battle machines on the scale of Titans were far more common than in later millennia. Also, power availability and so on would have been perhaps more efficient and easier. Titans and other super heavy vehicles are often considered base killers, so it only stands to reason that a fortification would have sought a means by which to fire back in kind. In a technological zenith period that was not hamstrung by the many limitations in the age of the Imperium, volcano cannons make sense as a defensive weapon ranking between the planetary defense laser and the turbo laser destructor, if only used for installations of major importance. However, as is always the case in the foggy, dark future of humanity, some early sources do indicate that the defense laser and the volcano cannon have always been essentially the same, and that the versions mounted on Titans as the volcano cannon are in fact stripped down defense lasers. In a certain way, this does make sense, as it would explain why the weapon's evolution occurred after the Dark Age of technology, when the Mechanicus' distrust of invention had already taken hold. And remember that for the Mechanicus, adapting an existing weapon to a new purpose isn't necessarily banned and heretical, although just how much a piece of tech might be adapted is something of a grey area. This might also help us to explain why the variants from the Mark I to the Mark IV represented decreasing levels of energy instead of the inverse. Remembering that the Mark II was so powerful, it literally destroyed any vehicle it was mounted on, including Titan's arms. Knowing the uncertainty, secrets and clashing histories always present in the 40k verse, coupled with the Imperium's gradual but inevitable technological decline, it's even possible that the Adeptus Mechanicus had lost the means to truly create volcano cannons millennia ago, and the weapons we see in use across the galaxy today are in fact ancient stripped down defense lasers from ages past. On top of all of this, we have the oddity where it's described that crystal shards created by heretical psykers in the modern Imperium are the only means to create the power of the volcano cannon. How does this work? This doesn't seem to fit in the context, it doesn't make sense within the history of the volcano cannon. Now, to repeat what I just said, we might consider that the Mechanicus had lost the knowledge of how to produce the power of a volcano cannon that was once a variant used in planetary defensive systems, and that now they can only be made practically operational through the use of these bizarre psi crystals. Or, another explanation I thought of was that perhaps, as we saw through the various failed attempts to create this scaled down weapon through Mark I, Mark II, etc., the issue was in lacking the knowledge to reasonably scale down the sheer power of a defense laser. Now, through the use of these psi crystals, which seem to have the property to sort of absorb energy, they may have been the key to what enabled the Mechanicus to successfully produce a battlefield-scaled defense laser, a volcano cannon, and so perhaps these crystals help to focus or regulate the power and help keep the weapon stable. This would also make sense in terms of the weapon only being able to have 1500 uses, so again, perhaps they can only absorb so much or focus so much energy before they are no longer usable and the crystal has to be replaced. This is my speculation, but it seems logically reasonable to me. Like so much of the knowledge in the dark future, we likely can never truly know the specifics of such things, for they are so closely guarded by the Imperial administrators, inquisitors and tech priests, or the knowledge has simply been lost across the mists of time and the many millennia that humans continue to endure in these bleakest of ages. Ultimately, regardless of its origins or the more recent iterations, whether brought to the battlefield atop the chassis of a shadow sword, twinned upon a relic Falchian super heavy destroyer, or mounted upon the arm of a Reaver, Warlord or Imperator, the volcano cannon exists as a horrifying display of the sheer insanity of human ingenuity, coupled with a terrifyingly brazen willpower to use such a destructive weapon offensively, and very often even against their own kind. In many ways, the volcano cannon is an embodiment of mankind itself. It's self-assured, unrelenting, and more than willing to destroy itself, along with its enemies, rather than to ever admit defeat.